The Pintail was the first entirely new aircraft that Fairey made after the First World War. Although it looks pretty conventional, it was in fact quite an innovative aircraft, built to meet RAF Specification 21 in 1919 for a two-seat fighter reconnaissance amphibian that could be operated from water or off a carrier deck. Fairey designated the aircraft Project 21. It was powered by a 475 horsepower Napier Lion 5, which drove a large two-bladed propeller. The pilot had a fixed forward-firing synchronized Vickers machine gun. The observer had a Lewis gun on a scarf ring. So far, so conventional. The design's main feature was the absence of vertical tails above the fuselage, which was intended to give the observer an unrestricted field of fire. The deep fuselage was built in three sections. The centre was made of steel and carried the wing spars and the main undercarriage. Ahead of this was the engine, its mountings and cowlings. The rear fuselage section also carried the observer's cockpit. The two-bay wings had a span of 32 feet and 400 square feet of total area. They were fitted with Fairey's patent camber gear. This system had been introduced on the Hamber Baby, and it allowed the ailerons to be used as flaps during takeoff for extra lift. They were lowered by rotating a hand wheel in the cockpit. Pretty much all Fairey aircraft of the era had this system, as it allowed impressively short takeoff and landing runs. A new feature for the Pintail was interconnection between the camber changing system and the tailplane adjustment wheels. They were on the same spindle so that fore and aft trim was automatically adjusted to compensate for the change in centre of pressure brought about by raising or lowering the flaps. The controls also featured some balancing improvements that reduced controlled forces. The wings could be folded down to 15 feet and 8 inches for shipboard storage if required. Upper and lower wings were staggered, with the top wing being very close to the fuselage. This setup was beneficial aerodynamically, but it made cockpit ingress difficult and restricted the pilot's visibility in basically all directions. This was a bug, or perhaps a feature, of several contemporary aircraft. Designers were trying to push designs to the extreme to take advantage of new and more powerful engines. And on the engine front, another innovation on the Pintail was the provision of a starting battery so that the engine could be started without physically moving the propeller. What luxury! There was no generator, so the battery couldn't be charged in flight, but the electric start was a significant step forward. 4 distinct versions of the design were constructed, starting with Pintail 1, aircraft N133. This made its first flight on July 7, 1920, and it was originally fitted with amphibian gear in which the wheels, mounted on a swinging frame, were, when retracted, housed within the floats. These had spring-loaded doors over the wheel wells. The arrangement wasn't successful, because the doors could not be kept watertight when closed and mud collected in the wheel wells when they were open. The first prototype appears to have been fitted later on with a second version of the gear in which the wheels, again mounted on a swinging frame, were positioned between the floats. Because of the amphibian gear issues, Pintail 2, N134, wasn't flown until the 25th of May 1921. Pintail 2 had a lengthened 40-foot fuselage and a similar type of amphibian undercarriage to the modified Pintail 1, though with the wheels now swinging up and down outboard of the floats. The undercarriage of this aircraft was later modified on the lines of that for Pintail 3, flown in November 1921. It had fixed wheels within the floats, from which they protruded sufficiently for land-based operations, but not so much that they interfered too seriously with the waterborne behaviour and performance. The new floats and a further refined 20-foot-long version of them that would later be used on the Flycatcher appear to have been a broadly successful design. The complete package was, however, not purchased by the RAF, as they were busy trying to save the service and were buying barely any aircraft. Pintail had decent performance with 125 mph top speed and 1500 foot-per-minute climb rate. It was therefore rather faster than the Parnell Panther fleet fighter of 1918, but not sufficiently spectacular to justify the RAF buying it. 3 examples were, however, picked up by Japan as the Pintail 4 as late as November 1924. That had some modifications to improve visibility and pilot comfort. The upper wing was raised 9 inches and the floats were further refined. That cost £50 in weight but had little impact on performance. Exactly what happened to these aircraft is not clear. They aren't mentioned in any of the major histories of Japanese interwar aircraft. Although the Pintail was rejected for naval use in the UK, it didn't actually die there. In 1921, the RAF issued a new specification for an Army cooperation aircraft. It was very unambitious, essentially asking for an aircraft that could carry a heavier bomb load than the Airco DH-9, but was 6 miles an hour slower. The DH-9 dated back to the summer of 1917, and it had been introduced into service in November. In response, Fairey essentially created a land-plane version of the Pintail that they called the Fawn. These days, advertising standards would probably want a word with the company. The Fawn was not a looker. In fact, it was actively scary looking from some angles. It did, however, retain the Pintail's stable handling and rugged construction, based around the steel centre section. 70 were made in 3 versions, with the later 2 and 3 serving as light bombers, carrying a 460-pound bomb load that consisted of 2 230 or 412-pound bombs on underwing bomb racks. Power once again came from a Napier Lion, although the early aircraft had the 450 horsepower Lion 2 rather than the 475 horsepower Lion 5. In reality, this made no practical performance difference. The size of the Lion engine gave the Fawn the same issue as the Pintail, in that the very large engine restricted the view forward. A big change early in development was triggered by a change to the Air Ministry's fire protection requirements. This led to the fuselage fuel tanks being deleted, leaving an unfilled void. The tank was moved to the upper wing surface, initially in a single tank on the port side, and later in 2 large and ungainly semi-streamlined structures, one on each side. It made the Fawn even less attractive, and negatively impacted handling characteristics. Worse still, if the aircraft overturned on landing, then the tank would rupture, with terminal results for the crew. Other lessons from the Pintail did feed into the Fawn's overall design. The wings were unstaggered, and the gap to the top wing was changed to something more conventional. Span increased to 49 feet and 11 inches, up 10 feet. Most obviously, the rear vertical surfaces changed to a more conventional format. The ventral fin was deleted after the first prototype, and an angular but conventional rudder was included. 3 prototypes were ordered on the 6th of June 1922, and the first flew in March 1923, followed by another pair in September 1923. Several sources have it that the second prototypes had lengthened fuselages for better stability, but the actual specification data says that the Fawn is actually 2 inches shorter than the Pintail. So either the early prototype was shortened, or a mistake in a 1960s book has become the common wisdom. 2 more prototypes were ordered in February 1923 as pre-production versions of the Fawn 2 powered by the Lion 2. The first of these flew on the 29th of January 1924, and 46 of them were ordered for the RAF. They were followed by 20 Fawn 3s with the Lion 5 engine. These switched the radiator position from a lateral slab type to a chin type, altered the fuel tanks to the 2-tank arrangement, and changed the internal layout. All Fawns were designed to carry either 2 men and bombs, or 3 men. In the Mark III, the observer's seat was arranged to fold into the floor of the cockpit. For bombing, the cockpit floor, with the seat folded into it, was lifted out of the way, and the bottom aluminium cowling slid backwards while the observer lay on the floor of the third cockpit, which contained readily detachable seat bearers and a seat which was easily swung out of the way. If only 2 men were carried, then the third cockpit contained flares and a parachute. Irrespective of this flexibility, the Fawn was in general little liked by the RAF. It offered the same bomb load as the DH-9 in a package that was 50% heavier, but had the same speed and similar climbing performance. Visibility was worse than the DH-9. Only endurance was somewhat improved, being half an hour longer than the DH-9. The Fawn therefore only replaced DH-9As in 3 of 6 light bomber squadrons, all of them in the UK. It was then itself replaced in 1926. Some aircraft continued in RAF service to test a turbo-supercharged version of the Lion, starting in March 1925 and continuing for 3 years. Apparently a Fawn 1 was also used to test a variant of the Lion called the Lion S, which was run inverted in order to reduce the height of the engine. Fairey themselves were disappointed with the aircraft, and they were critical of the unambitious initial specification and shifting detailed requirements during the development. They felt that the ministry was unwilling to engage in dialogue with suppliers and thus ended up with an unimpressive product. Charles Fairey's response was the revolutionary Fox, which was one of the aircraft that shook the British establishment out of its post-war malaise and created the conditions for better-known aircraft like the Hart and then the Hurricane and the Spitfire. So, because of what it wasn't, the humble Pintail is arguably one of the most important aircraft of the interwar period.